Hello and welcome to NewsClick. Today, we are going to discuss the developments in South Korea in our mapping fault lines. This time, the fault lines, of course, are within the nation, but also it has implications for the larger fault lines in East Asia. Let's go quickly to the events that have taken place this morning, 14th of December, in which President Yoon Suk Yeol has been impeached by the parliament. There was an earlier impeachment motion which was moved. At that time, they did not have the requisite numbers. This time, the second impeachment motion has succeeded. So about 12 of the party to which the president belonged have also voted for his impeachment, and subsequently the defense minister, couple of army generals have also been charged with treason, which is also the charge which is going to come on the president, because without passing the necessary measures, what he declared was a military rule, though it was couched as a president's rule. But it was military rule by which he essentially tried to get rid of the parliament. This, for the Korean people, was a huge no-no. 40 years of military rule is what they had earlier. They've got out of it. You can see the celebrations that took place outside following what had happened when the president was impeached. The impeachment motion was passed. There were celebrations outside in various forms. This is, again, apparently something to do with K-pop, which I don't know much about. So all these pictures that we have gone through just now show the celebrations outside. Clearly, the Korean people did not want a reversion to the kind of military rule they had in the first 40 years of their history. Let's look at his numbers. When President Yoon was elected, he had about 49% of support, which is not a very big margin. In fact, it is quite a slender margin over his opponent. And if you look at the drop that has happened, you can see a significant drop of his numbers, and it had come to about 12-13% when he declared martial law, when his numbers fell even more. So clearly, loss of support is something that had been happening all this while, and therefore his ability to govern had been reduced, particularly after the parliament elections took place in April 2024, a few months, 7-8 months back, after which his majority was such that he could not get anything passed through the parliament. Whether it was budget, various other measures, he did not want to work with the parliament. He was not willing to work with the opposition to get a consensus budget, a consensus set of legislation passed. And therefore, in this deadlock, he thought the martial law, dissolving the parliament or removing its power and governing as a military president would then be something that he would be able to do. Of course, he completely misjudged the temper of the people, what people are willing to accept. And clearly, when the parliamentarians had gathered that night to vote on this question of martial law, there's an emergency meeting they had called, then the military seems to have been not willing to take action against the parliamentarians to stop them from holding the parliament session. Parliament met, decided to overturn the military, his declaration of emergency, and having lost that, then they tried to impeach him. First time they failed, second time they have succeeded. So this is in a nutshell what happened with President Yoon, and what is going to happen in the future is something that we have to, of course, observe. Whether you will get a solution in which a stopgap president takes over, the prime minister takes over at the moment, and then new presidential elections are called, is something we'll have to wait and observe. Before we get into any of the future issues, let's take a quick look back at the past, because a lot of the reaction of the past is what is driving the politics of today. This is the picture of East Asia. Now, if we look at this picture, this shows South Korea and North Korea as two separate entities. This emerged really after the Second World War, because at that point of time, Japan had occupied Korea. The resistance against the Japanese occupation really came from the communists, who aligned, of course, with the Soviet Union and China, who were both fighting Japan. And in that, Kim Il-sung was a leader. We'll come to those pictures later. Kim Il-sung was the leader, and Syngman Rhee, who was at that time aligned with the Kuomintang China, which also was an ally of the Communist Party of China, fought the resistance to Japan together. In that, Syngman Rhee did not have any major part. The resistance was done really by Kim Il-sung and his people on the ground. But post the Second World War, and this is the important part, Syngman Rhee declares himself the president of Korea. And there is a civil war which goes on, in which Syngman Rhee is supported entirely by the United States. And this is where the famous Korean War takes place, in which finally China also enters. The US, of course, had entered before that, had supported South Korea under Syngman Rhee, pushing out the communists. And at some point when China entered, they rolled that back. The war froze along this is the famous 38th parallel, which divides North Korea and South Korea, which was finally reached as an armistice. It was not a declaration of peace. It was not an agreement to stop fighting. It was a temporary armistice in which both sides agreed, okay. So one of the arguments that North Korea has, even till today, that armistice means a lot of things, and one of them is South Korea's military is under the jurisdiction of the American military, which is also posted in South Korea. So effectively, though South Korea is politically independent, militarily it is still a part of an American general, who then decides, who is a joint leader of the joint command of the armistice forces, which includes South Korea and the American forces in South Korea. So this armistice still has not been resolved into a peace agreement, and that is why Kim Il-jung and President Trump met a number of times to try and resolve the issue. Some agreements were reached, but finally the armistice still stays as an armistice and is not a peace agreement. So this is Syngman Rhee, who came in at the time, as we are talking about, when the war against Japan was on. He headed essentially the American view of what would be Korea after the war. Attempt failed. What took place, we've already gone over that. But Syngman Rhee not only ruled South Korea, but he also decimated the communists. Large number of people were killed. Again, those pictures of what happened then have now started emerging. Large number of massacres. So that was the legacy that Syngman Rhee left South Korea. It continued after that. So when people talk about Kim Il-sung, they make various comments. But the point is, he's the one who was looked as a liberator in Korea, both South and North, for having resisted the Japanese and having built up military resistance to it, which was what the Americans were trying to undercut, because the massacre of the communists under Syngman Rhee is what happened south of the 38th parallel. And that is the history that still haunts South Korea. South Korea had, after Syngman Rhee, Park Chung-hee, this is not his photo, who ruled for about 8-10 years. Again, military rule, dictatorship. After that, Chun Do-wan, again military dictatorship. After Park was assassinated, he came into power. Again, another military figure. And this lasted till 87. So post Second World War, really, about little more than 40 years, South Korea has been under either autocratic rule or under direct military rule. And that history changes because under the President Chun Do-wan, there were large-scale protests that took place. And those protests finally meant that military surrendered power, accepted that there will be civilian rule, elections were held. This is the short history of the background in which we have to understand the current struggles taking place in the region and also the specificity of South Korea. South Korea is much richer than North Korea today. It has a developed industry. It is in the supply chain of the United States for major supplies from chips to other equipment. It has been able, Samsung for example, is a major player in the IT space as well as in television space. So all that is there. And therefore, today, South Korea is much richer than North Korea. But the problem that they have still is one of legitimacy. And the kind of protest we have seen break out in South Korea against a re-imposition of military rule, which is what the current president, who's now on the impeachment list, that was the reason that there is so much of popular resistance movements that took place against him. The people rejected, not only the parliament, people rejected. Students came out, workers came out in large numbers, protesting against the imposition of the military rule, which the president had done virtually in the dark. It is that resistance of the people which led finally to his party, which had abstained in the first impeachment elections, denied therefore the numbers needed to impeach President Yoon. That numbers, seeing the kind of resistance that happened, the kind of movements on the ground, the people coming out in the streets, led finally to a section of his own party voting for impeachment. And that is why finally the impeachment was passed. Without the support of about 10 to 12 members of his party, this impeachment motion could not have been passed. And it has happened because the will of the South Korean people, particularly the students, younger people, the workers, have been expressed clearly that they don't want to go back to military rule, which is what President Yoon was proposing to them. And I think that rejection of the military rule is a very important, what shall we say, historical event in South Korea's history, because the reconciliation with North Korea, getting over from armistice and military confrontation to a peace process, getting out of America's military rule, I won't say, but still military control of South Korea is also something that should be on Korea's agenda, South and North both. And if only the American forces leave South Korea, can South and North Korea work by themselves? What is their future going to be? And I think that is the important lesson of what we have seen, that it is not just a South Korean issue, not just a question of democracy in South Korea, but a larger issue of geopolitics of the region and therefore of interest to us in our mapping fault lines. Thank you very much for being with us, and please do see NewsClick's other shows and also our mapping fault lines, which will try and bring you every week.